As we're commemorating the War of 1812, let's remember it's commemoration and not celebration. Because these guys went through very painful deaths. And I'm going to show you some more kind of horrors that are reflected in these remains. And I think we have to keep our mind on that as we commemorate and mark the anniversary of the war. This man had been shot in the head. He was wearing a U.S. uniform, but he had musket shot in his head, which likely means he was shot by one of his own, because they were the only ones, the Americans were using the musket shot. And that is a copper bandage pin, and that's human hair that was still sticking to this guy's head. It was obviously a bandage for his wound, from which he died. We found a number of copper bandage pins around a number of the burials around injuries, and the injuries were very easy to see. Burial 17 was another burial that had an extra leg, a third leg. So another grave that had been buried, a leg put in, and then the body. That is an American uniform. 2 buttons found here were 104th foot. We believe that this leg is a British leg. Close up of the leg. That's all that went in. Burial 19 for me is the worst story of them all. As you look at this body, having looked at the rest, what you should be seeing is a lot of fragmentation here and a big hole right there. There's the big hole. And everything below it and immediately above it has shattered. We think this is a cannonball that hit the guy directly. Went right through him, shattered his pelvis. This is what the physical anthropologist, actually one of the most experienced guys around, a guy named Doug Owsley, he can't explain it any other way. Cannonball through him, took out his whole innards, shattered the pelvis, and shattered above it. He obviously dies instantly. And we find him exactly as he was buried. Burial 23, slightly different story. Absolutely no outward sign of what he might have died of. But there are some clues. Check out his feet. And around his neck, so this is right here. Here's his skull, right here. And these are bone buttons. Those are the only buttons he has on, and it's probably an undershirt. Okay, and he's got bone buttons, which we find. But his legs and his feet are bound. In other words, this guy has probably been in the hospital, in the tent. When he dies, he's only wearing an undershirt, and his legs and feet are bound, and he's taken to the grave. In the War of 1812, 75% of the deaths in camp are from dysentery or camp disease. We suspect that's what this guy died of, because there's no outward sign, there's no hard tissue damage to this guy at all. It could have been a soft tissue injury, but we think he was in the hospital for a while and sick. Feature 25 is another medical waste pit of a fairly substantial leg, meaning cut off at the femur, and the rest of the leg there just buried. And then we had a number of burials that were very disturbing. What you're looking at here is the edge of the construction trench for the foundation of the George House. And everything above that line, which is about here, went with the Georges, and everything below it we found. There's a better one. Everything above the legs went with the Georges. Everything below the legs, or below the waist, well, not even below the waist. You can see how that trench was slightly angled. That's all that we got. So while we're in the field, we're obviously starting to put the story together, but there's lots of work that needs to be done in the lab to really figure it all out. The team was led by two people, a guy by the name of Jerry Sobalski from the National Museum in Ottawa, and Susan Pfeiffer, who at the time was at University of Guelph, who is now at University of Toronto. And we had a series of specialists who had various foci or specialties. This guy is Pierre Moore-Jansen, his whole thing in life was basically human crania, and he could figure out all sorts of things from cranial reconstruction. And so we had these folks working in Guelph at ROM, we had space at ROM, and we had space in our office, and we were all working together basically from December through May to get an answer. I had to file a coroner's report by the end of May, which would then inform who got sent back to the US in June, because the ceremony was to be in June, to move them back. And all of this was being driven by the Canadian, or the Ontario Anatomy Act and the Ontario Cemeteries Act. Back to fuss and feathers. This guy, and the success of the Americans in the Niagara campaign came because they were well trained and drilled, and they looked like regulars. And in fact, the British General Ryle is supposed to have said something along the line of, by God, they're regulars at Chippewa. Because these guys drilled onto the field, they held their lines under intense fire, and they basically held the field at the end of the day at Chippewa. And most scholars put it up to the fact that Scott had really, really trained these guys, drilled them. The daily regimen was amazing. Up at dawn, they drilled for 4 hours, they had breakfast, they drilled again, and then they had off till about 4 o'clock in the afternoon. They would drill again, and then they would have the evening off. But it was with 50-pound packs. Most of the hard work building the encampment at the fort was by hand. These guys, there was something like 2,500 broad axes purchased from Buffalo, from Black Rock in August of that year. And the physical evidence of that was startling. Half of all of the soldiers had these depressions, which are known as Schmorl's depressions, or cortical excavations in their bone where major muscles attach. And they're sometimes seen in farm populations in the general public, but the statistics at this site led the physical anthropological team to simply say these guys had been worked very hard. And it's absolutely reflected in the hard tissue of these guys. So we've basically got 28 guys going back, 28 American soldiers. We have 53 fractured bones among them. So that's pre-mortem fractures. We have a bilateral amputation. There's another absolutely major fracture of this tibia that was eventually amputated, and a whole knee blown out here. This one is very interesting. I can't tell you what kind of nuttiness went on in the media. Like, I still remember it vividly. Picking up the Buffalo, what was it called, Deb? Buffalo News? Is that what it was? Yeah, Buffalo News. You pick up the Buffalo News. Archaeologists find barber and guy getting shaved, something like that. It's like, what? And what they had done is they had been there on the Friday before, and they got wind we had found a bilateral amputation where a guy's lower arms had been taken off, so he's basically getting a bilateral amputation. We never found him, so we presume he survived, by the way. And when they had come through, they saw another guy laid out, and he didn't have his head. So all the body was laid out, and he didn't have his head. There's a very famous story of the siege in which a cannonball comes off, takes off the barber's hands and the head of the guy getting the haircut or getting the shave. So the media are all over it like that. Well, the problem was the day before, we had taken the head off the body and put it in our lab. And this is about a 16-year-old. This is a very, very young boy. But the media had put this elaborate story together without checking with any of us. They're just, full-time working on this. So it was, as horrible as this was, they were playing with the data and making up stories. It's 1987. Who's the Prime Minister of Canada? So at the time, we were sure this was a Mulrooney relative. But it's actually what's called a Habsburg jaw, which is crowded dentition, which comes from inbreeding. So it's probably a rural farming population. This is dental hypoplasia on these teeth, and this is pitting along the teeth. That's a sure sign of nutritional stress in this individual. Statures. So we have Snake Hill in the kind of dark red, and an entire infantry company in the blue, just to compare them. And we found that a lot of them were disproportionately tall, of the Snake Hill guys. Well, as it turned out, where this cemetery was where we believe the New York militia had established their camp a little late, and it was a brigade by Porter. And he was known to have selected for his unit, which included riflemen, splendidly big fellows. So we suspect that really we're also seeing a reflection of that in the folks that we found. Ages, you can also see a full age representation here for Bradford's company, and you can see that we have some older folks among the Snake Hill guys. We're not sure what that's about, frankly. Don't know. We don't believe that any of the people that we found were officers. We believe they were all soldiers who were not retrograded to Black Rock. We did some work with oxygen isotope, which was just a breaking technique in the late 80s. There was a guy named Henry Schwartz at McMaster University who we turned to. And what oxygen isotope does is it looks at the chemical constituent in your bone that's a reflection of your drinking water, and were we able to see where these guys came from based on the oxygen in the bone. And Henry concluded some of these guys were from Pennsylvania, Vermont area as opposed to southern Ontario, which fit the archival record pretty well, but frankly it was very preliminary when we did it. We also did lead tests on all of them. This was done by the famous Ofterheide in Minnesota, who did the Franklin guys. And we did have 3 that seemed to have higher blood levels than all the rest, who were kind of clustered there, as you can see, between 0 and 50 parts per whatever it is. And in terms of what symptoms those folks would have had, at least 2 of them would have had subjective symptoms and maybe the beginning of a little bit of neuropathy or colic. So this is not serious, but one or 2 of them may have been suffering from it. And the one guy we think was a European based on his diet, because we also did carbon and nitrogen, and we were looking at the kind of plants in their diet. And one guy we think spent most of his life growing up in Europe, and we think he also was the one that had the highest lead levels. So he kind of stood out. So how does this all end? We create a report out of all of this. And we identify 28 of 31 graves as American. The others did not have anything with them that could lead us to conclude that they were American. Do I believe they were American? Yes, but we were being very careful, very cautious, because we did not want to send a British individual back to a national cemetery in the US. And that's where these guys were headed. So in fact, the Fort Erie High School gymnasium was set up as a morgue, and our staff, that's Bev Garner, was working with the US Total Mortuary Recovery Agency, who brought the coffins and the flags, and every single one of these guys was put in their own coffin, flag draped, as you can see there. And once that had been accomplished, they spent the night on the grounds, on the parade ground at Old Fort Erie. And I don't know whether Steve Otto, who's in the crowd, remembers, but the Old Fort York Guard came up to Fort Erie and stood guard with some Fort Erie folk. And the Presidential Guard came to take the remains as they were handed off by the Fort York Guard and some Fort Erie folks, handed over to the Presidential Guard, and each placed in coffins, and the Peace Bridge shut down, and all of them taken across the border on the Peace Bridge to Bath National Cemetery in central New York State. And they did an American jet flyover as part of this. And as you can see, the Channel 7 reporter from Buffalo and the Americans, vets, watching this, turned out in the hundreds. There were thousands on the day of the repatriation. And for us on that day, it was a very poignant and evocative day, because these folks who we had been with since November, we were handing off back to the Americans in November. All of the artifacts that had been found with them went back into the grave with each individual, including the buttons. And the only thing that stayed out were the medical specimens. They did not go back in the ground. But we were very aware of the wishes of Americans. And here's one from July 26. From this private in the Pennsylvania Volunteers who remarks on his friend Thomas Poe, whose last wish is to be taken back to the American side of the river. And what we have here basically is one of our tents with the Buffalo skyline in the background as they're resting here. But eventually these guys made it back, and they're buried in Bath National Cemetery. And that's the end of the slides.